It says it's live. Okay. So, good afternoon. Since we've got a little bit of a late start, it is most definitely afternoon now. Blasphemy. It's one of those great English words. It just sounds like you have to shout it, right? You can't just say blasphemy. It's blasphemy.
With feeling.
With feeling, exactly. Just that massive accusation. But what does blasphemy mean? What is blasphemy?
Like sacrilegious.
It's sacrilegious. So
Like a no-no.
A no-no. So is blasphemy then anything that is anti-religious? If I say services are boring, is that blasphemy?
No.
No?
No.
So it can't just be anti-religious then?
No. It's got to be against the principles of our religions.
So it's against the religious principles or first articles of faith. So if someone was to say, God did not create the world, that would be blasphemy?
I don't think so.
No?
I think it would be. You're going against all the principles of our faith, what we've been taught to believe.
But it's an opinion of people who may not necessarily believe as we believe.
Right. So it's definitely a different opinion, but is it a blasphemous opinion?
No. Difference of opinion would mean that. I mean, if you're defaming something, that would be sacrilegious.
So there's some form of defamation. So if I just say God didn't create the world, am I defaming God? Or am I just making in it an inaccurate statement about God?
The latter.
It's just an inaccuracy.
Yes.
So there has to be some form of antagonism, right? If someone just said something against the faith without meaning to be offensive, but just out of ignorance or being silly or something, would we call that blasphemy? Well, what about this other lovely category of heresy?
That would be sacrilegious.
So what's the difference between heresy and blasphemy? Because I'll give you a hint. One of them you get killed for, the other one you don't.
Oh.
Blasphemy is a capital crime, according to the Torah, as we're going to read. So it's kind of important to know what blasphemy is if someone could be executed for it.
I mean, if you're defaming God's name, that's blasphemy.
Defamation of God's name. Should have left a space there, of God's name. Whereas maybe saying God didn't create the world, that would be more heresy. That maybe if you're stating something that goes against the cardinal principles of faith, that's heretical, but not necessarily blasphemous.
That's right. It's not a capital. That's somebody's opinion.
It may be a wrong opinion.
Yes.
But it's not necessarily has the element of defamation. The problem is that we often use the term, you will often hear authors and speakers and pundits and writers using the terms blasphemy and heresy to attack anyone that disagrees with their opinion. Right? You know, those who say that electricity is permissible on Shabbos are blasphemers, or they are heretics, take your pick. And the words are used almost interchangeably. But Torah, as given by God, is precise and not meant to just use these words loosey-goosey, especially when the consequences are so severe. Because when you call someone a blasphemer, you are saying that under ideal circumstances of proper court and evidentiary procedure, you are guilty of a capital crime and should be killed. That's what you mean when you call someone a blasphemer. Or when you say their statement is blasphemous.
If we go back to when Rabin was
Mm-hmm.
Indirectly, wasn't that one of the accusations that some of the rabbis had made?
The accusation,
That young
right?
man,
So prior to Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing, the accusations that were being leveled by certain rabbis in Israel was that he was a rodef, that he was a pursuer, that he was attempting to harm Jews, and therefore anybody who was attempting to harm another person can be stopped up to and including the loss of their life. The classic example of the knife-wielding maniac chasing after someone, and you've got a gun and you can shoot them. You shoot them before they kill someone. And that was the language that was being used. It wasn't necessarily that he was either a blasphemer or a heretic, although they said similar things. The main legal hook for his assassination was that he was a rodef, that he was a pursuer, that would bring harm to the Jewish people, and therefore it was permitted or even required to kill him. That was the argument. I wouldn't use the word logic. That was the argument that was put forward and which was used by his assassin. So it wasn't necessarily that he himself was blasphemous or heretical as a reason for his assassination. Well, let's get down to the story of blasphemy that the Torah has given us, and then we'll look at how our tradition has tried to understand the laws of blasphemy, and then we'll see what that means for us. So we are in Parashat Emor, page 732. We're right up at the end of the parasha. And I need a volunteer to read.
if I can find it.
Starting with verse 10.
Starting with verse 10, top of the page. Do we have to draw straws?
There came out among the Israelites one whose mother was Israelite and whose father was Egyptian.
All right, so a little backstory before we get to the story. It's nice of the Torah to give us a little bit more background. So we're going to be dealing with a man whose mother is an Israelite and whose father was Egyptian, and that he apparently has come out during the Exodus along with us, rather than staying with his father's people in the land of Egypt. Make sense? Okay.
And a fight broke out in the camp between the half-Israelite and a certain Israelite.
Right, so it's the son of the Israelite woman fights with the son of an Israelite man, is the literal reading of the Torah, which, as the JPS translation renders to us, it's the son of the Israelite woman and Egyptian man now fighting with the son of an Israelite woman and Israelite man. So it's the word half is a bit misleading, but those are the two combatants.
The son of the Israelite woman.
Meaning also from the Egyptian man.
Pronounced the name in blasphemy, and he was brought to Moses. Now his mother's name was Shelomith, daughter
Or Shlomit.
Shelomith, daughter of
Dibri. Mm-hmm.
of the tribe of Dan, and he was placed in custody until the decision of the Lord should be made clear to them.
Okay, so what did he do?
He pronounced the name of God in blasphemy.
Okay, so we've got the word that's going to be our operative word being translated here as blasphemy, but apparently, at least so far, I hate English spelling, at least one of the main requirements of blasphemy appears to be the name. That if you didn't use the name, then it can't count as blasphemy. But we're going to have to come back to what this blasphemy is. Is it just uttering the name? Is it uttering it in a particular way? Is it using it as a swear word, or is it in some other form that is what creates the blasphemy? And our sages will help us with that. But that's what we got so far. Somehow he misused the name of God, and now he's in custody.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the blasphemer outside the camp, and let all who were within hearing lay their hands upon his head, and let the whole community stone him.
All right, so he will be executed, and this will be done in the eyes of the whole community, and this will be done according to all of those who witnessed him utter these words, right? Because that's part of the effect of blasphemy. It's not just a question of what were you thinking, it's a question of what did you say, because once you say those words and they're out of your mouth, they are coming rushing at me, and they are hitting my ears whether I want them to or not. It's the nature of language.
But if these people are surrounding him that heard him speak,
Mm-hmm.
and they are that close that they can put their hands on his head,
Right?
and the stones start coming.
They don't keep their hands on his head while the stones are being
Oh,
done. And stoning, and someday we'll do a whole class on the different forms of execution. Stoning is not like Life of Brian with a bunch of people throwing rocks at someone.
all right.
Stoning was taking to a high place and pushing the person off, and so they'd hit the ground
You did explain.
and be stoned in that way. And then a large stone would be used if the first impact didn't kill them. But the idea here about putting their hands on his head, well, what does that remind you of? A priestly blessing, or from earlier in the book of Leviticus. See, we don't do sacrifices enough. This is also how sacrifices work, right? You bring your cow to the gate of the Mishkan, and you put your hands on its head, and you confess your sins, and then the cow goes and becomes expiation. Right? We see this when we do the Avodah service during Yom Kippur. We're reminded of this every year, of the idea of putting the hands on the head of the animal that's going to be the sacrifice, as a symbolic transferring of the guilt to that which is about to be killed. And here there's a real feeling that the people who witnessed the blasphemy, the people who were present for it, are stained by having heard what they heard. And they want to unburden that stain onto the cause of it, so that with his death, they will be free of that burden. Make sense? Right? It's a little bit of an unusual phrase, because I mean, most of us are not accustomed to feeling burdened by having heard what we heard, or we don't feel guilty about having heard what someone else said. It's on them. It's not on me. It's, you know, the old playground thing. I'm rubber, you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off me and sticks to you. It's not. It doesn't stick to me just because you chose to say something horrible and offensive. I may be unhappy that I happened to be there, but it's done. And this is saying, no, you were affected because you heard whatever was happening with God's name happen. And that needs expiation, that needs atonement, that needs cleansing from you. And that's what's taking place. Onward.
And to the Israelite people speak thus: anyone who blasphemes his God shall bear his guilt. If he also pronounces the name Lord, he shall be put to death. The whole community shall stone him, stranger or citizen, if he has thus pronounced the name, and he shall be put to death. If anyone kills,
Pause there.
okay,
Right. So what's the rule then for blasphemy?
that he has to be put to death.
Well,
If
what?
he pronounces the name of the Lord.
All right. So we get a repetition of the notion of the name, and the word that they're translating as blasphemy here is yikalel, which usually would be rendered as to curse or disparage or demean in some way. So you can be mikalel lots of different things in life, not just God. But it seems to be then that he is somehow using the name of God and simultaneously cursing God. And it's the combined effect of that plus that gets us back to blasphemy. So it's not just that he said the name of God, and it's not just that he cursed God or cursed someone else. It's a combined effect of cursing God with God's own name. And if you're not 100% sure on that, that's why we have commentary. Okay, let's see how well I can slide slide down.
Whoops.
Very good.
Not bad. Only lost one page.
Thank you.
All right, so Rashi, based off Sifra, one of the earliest midrashic texts from the early period, gives us a little bit of a close reading of that verse 15 that you just had. So let's see how he breaks it apart.
Any man who blasphemes his God shall bear his sin. He shall be punished by
Excision. I know the Hebrews don't. The Hebrews easier. Karet. Right? So what Rashi is saying here, based off Sifra, based off the teachings of the sages, is that if somebody blasphemes God and there was no warning, like for any other capital crime, the person bears their guilt. And what does it mean by bears their guilt? It means that they will suffer karet, which is, according to rabbinic teachings, spiritual excision. Another shorthand would be death at the hand of heaven. So let's say somebody blasphemes against God, but there was no warning to him not to. Just like if somebody murders somebody, but there was no warning to him not to. In both cases, you cannot execute the person. Executions under Jewish law can only happen when there was an explicit and acknowledged warning, along with a lot of other conditions that have to be met. Capital punishment was not something taken very lightly. And this is trying to say that if someone blasphemed and was not under the normal capital punishment rubric, they didn't get warned or other features were missing, then they can't be executed. But they will suffer punishment at the hand of heaven. That is to say, God will get them. But the court won't. Because the court can't. Make sense? Maybe?
I'm not sure about the warning part.
Okay. So in Jewish law in general, for any capital crime, murder, adultery, violation of Shabbat willfully, and other such things, for the court to execute someone, there are a number of conditions that had to have been met. There had to have been two witnesses. The two witnesses have to have ironclad, rock solid, and absolutely incontrovertible evidence of the guilt. So if they disagree on any of the particulars, they don't count as witnesses. And the person had to have been warned prior to their act. And by prior, they don't just mean at some point in their past, they mean immediately before they did it. They had to have been told, if you do X, the punishment is death. And the person has to acknowledge also right before they do it, yes, I understand, and then they do it anyway. And if all of those conditions are met, and then a very complicated court process is also followed, and the person is found guilty, then they can be executed. But if one of those pieces is missing, they can be punished for some crimes in other ways by the court, but they cannot be executed according to the Torah.
So if somebody comes into a room and there are other people there,
Mm-hmm.
and this person comes into the room and he has a shovel and hits somebody over the head,
Right? And we all saw him,
and everybody saw him,
right?
and they can say and agree what happened,
Mm-hmm.
then that individual perpetrator can be put to death.
No.
No.
If the person walks in with a shovel and says, I'm going to kill him, and people say, don't do it or else you'll be executed,
Okay.
and he says, I know and I don't care, whack, then he can be
But
executed.
if he doesn't,
If he just runs in, goes, ah, and hits someone with a shovel,
then he can't.
he can't be. Because the taking of a life means you have to have incontrovertible proof that you know exactly the motivation of the person committing the crime. And their motivation includes their understanding of A, the forbiddenness of what they're doing, and the severity of what they're doing, and the severity of the punishment. And unless you are 100% convinced of all of that, you do not have enough evidence of their internal state to say that they are deserving of execution. And so the rabbinic court said that a person under those circumstances could not be executed. Like they could be punished in other ways, but they couldn't be executed.
So under Jewish law, if the Boston man who was in trial.
I mean, the Boston Marathon bomber, right? And under Jewish law, the Boston Marathon bomber is almost certainly not eligible for capital punishment.
Right.
He's eligible for all sorts of other punishments,
Yeah.
but not execution itself. And very few cases, according to Jewish law, are actually subject to capital punishment. And they talked about that in the Talmud, about the infrequency with which a person might be executed, because of the high bar that was set before execution. Judaism had a much higher bar set for execution than, of course, the Romans, who lived at the same time as the Talmud was being written, who would execute you for pretty much anything they felt like. But they also had a much higher bar for execution than modern American court systems.
Yes.
And as a result, I think we can say quite likely that a much smaller number of innocent people were ever executed by a Jewish court than by other courts. You still have the one option of getting two witnesses who are able to convincingly conspire together to provide false testimony. But that's about the only way that a person could be executed. And their testimony would have to be extremely convincing because of the way they would be interrogated by the court. Witnesses in capital crimes were interrogated. They weren't just asked, what did you see? They were run up and down the stairs and exhausted to try and break them down and see if their testimony would hold up. So it was not just a mild sit on the stand kind of testimony. And of course, if anyone was able to come and bring proof that they were lying about having been there to witness it, they were now subject to the death penalty. Because whatever testimony you falsified, whatever punishment the other person would have suffered by your false testimony becomes your penalty. So if you falsify it in a case of where the person might be flogged, you will be flogged. If you falsify in the case where the person might be stoned, you will be stoned.
So no plea bar.
Not so much.
Is that how the courts are run today in Israel?
No, the courts today are run off a modified civil system. There are certain rabbinic issues of personal status, marriage, divorce, etc., that are run loosely according to Jewish law, depending upon how you feel the current rabbinate is run, but at least claim to be run by Jewish law. But the other courts, theft and murder and such, are run by civil law.
Oh,
Okay.
And one who blasphemously pronounces.
So the Hebrew word nokev, which is right at the beginning of verse 16, right, denotes cursing. This is what Rashi's trying to point out to us. Because in verse 16, it just says, if he also pronounces.
Yes.
What Rashi is adding, based upon the Talmud, is that this word nokev is not just pronouncing. This is a type of cursing. It's pronouncing in a way that is meant to curse. And how do we know that? Well, we know from the story of Bilam, coming up in the book of Bamidbar, when he goes to curse the people of Israel on behalf of Balak, one of our enemies. He says, what can I curse, right? Ekov. And he uses the same word. So it's not just what can I say, it's what can I curse, or how could I curse? And so from that usage and a few other places where we see this verb used in a cursing manner, Rashi, based upon the Talmud, is saying, here it's also saying it's not just saying the name, it's cursing through the name. Or, as we're going to see more specifically, cursing the name itself. Onward.
And one who blasphemously pronounces the name. One is not liable for the death penalty unless he pronounces the name. However, one who curses using an ancillary name is not.
All right. So God has a name, right? The Yud, He, and Vav, He, right? The word that we normally pronounce as Adonai. If you do this with that name, now you are subject to the death penalty. If you do it with the English word God, you are not. Right? If you use another name from God, or the Holy One, blessed be He, or Hakadosh Baruch Hu, or any of these other forms, you are not subject to the death penalty. You can still be subject to flogging or other forms of punishment, but you cannot be executed unless both of these conditions are met. We're seeing the specificity with which the Torah is trying to teach us something about what blasphemy is. Yes?
It has to be a curse along with the name.
Exactly right, exactly. And if you lose one of those components, either by using a substitute name like the English word God, or by not actually cursing, but you use the real name, you may have transgressed something else, but you have not committed blasphemy. You have not transgressed this capital crime. All right, onward.
Blasphemer is punished only if he utters the divine name. Rabbi Joshua ben Korka said, the whole day of the trial, the witnesses are examined by means of a substitute for the divine name. May
Yossi.
Smite Yossi.
All right, so what they're saying is that how do you have a blasphemy trial?
Well, you can't pronounce.
Because you can't say what the guy said, because you'd be committing blasphemy if you were to repeat exactly what he said. And those of you who have seen the Life of Brian, they do a very funny bit on a guy who's being accused of blasphemy, and he's explaining what he said, and it's like, you're only making it worse for yourself. And then, of course, as he says, I don't want anyone else to say that name. And then, of course, now the guy who told people not to say that name, everybody's angry at him. So it's kind of a vicious circle. How do you have a trial where the words themselves are what was offensive, when the trial demands the witnesses say what was said? Because aren't they going to be guilty now? And so for the majority of the trial, they use a substitute. So instead of where it says Yossi, that is saying that what the guy actually said was God's name. So they're just using a euphemism. So may Yossi smite Yossi is a way of repeating what the guy said, and the judges would just insert God's name instead of Yossi every time they hear the word Yossi. And note the form, which we're going to come back to in a bit. May Yossi smite Yossi. Insert God's name for that, for the word Yossi. Exactly. It's like it would be saying, I'm going to use the English word God just because it's not such an issue. It'd be saying, may God strike God.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, except it does. And we're going to come back to that. But this is the paradigmatic form of blasphemy, according to Judaism, is somebody who is uttering a curse against God by means of God's name. That they are cursing God with God's own name. That's the paradigm for blasphemy, according to Judaism. And if that sounds confusing, good. Because that's what's going to make blasphemy. That's one of the problems in the modern world, is a lot of people just use the word blasphemy to mean, I don't like what you said. This is a very narrow, very specific, and very powerful theological statement that's being made. But let's finish the court case.
When the trial was finished, the accused was not executed on this evidence, but all persons were removed, and the chief witness was told.
That is to say, all the other random people. So now you have the only people left in the court are the accused, the judges, and the witnesses. That's it. All the bystanders and spectators are out of the room.
State literally what you heard. Thereupon he did so. The judges then arose and tore their garments, which were not to be resewn. The second witness stated, I too have heard thus. And the third says, I too heard thus.
All right, so you can't execute a person without actually hearing what he said. So they use the euphemistic substitution throughout the whole trial. And once it looks like he has been convicted, that this is indeed guilty on all the other evidence, you then need to make the main witness repeat what he actually said.
Literally.
literally, word for word, with God's name.
But then isn't he committing?
Well,
Blasphemy.
he is and he isn't. He is not committing blasphemy in the sense that he is intentionally using the name of God to curse God, and therefore he's not guilty of the capital crime. But for those who have to hear it, this is a terrible moment that they have to hear, which is why the judges stand up and tear their clothes, which, as you know from funerals, is a sign of mourning. Right? This is a terrible thing that it's been said, and with it not being resewn, with never properly repairing the cloth, it's a permanent reminder of having had to witness what had happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So even the judges during the case, when they hear the literal testimony, have to rend their garments. The witnesses would have rent their garments at the time they heard it in the first place, when the guy was first uttering this. So they do not have to re-rend. And then the second and third witness can just say ditto. They don't have to repeat verbatim what the guy said. They can say, yes, that is what we heard.
Rav Haya
Chia.
said, one who hears blasphemy nowadays is not obliged to rend his garments, because otherwise our garments would be nothing but tatters.
So very, very practical.
Everybody would be in rags.
Everyone would be in rags. If I had to tear my garments every time I heard someone blaspheme, I got nothing but rags. That actually doesn't become halacha. We are still required to tear if we were to hear. As we'll see, though, it's not a huge problem once we've got this defined down properly. Okay, so Rambam is going to summarize where we've gotten so far from his Mishnah Torah.
These are the laws which govern a blasphemer. A blasphemer is not liable to be stoned to death until he states God's unique name, which possesses 4 letters.
And that's the Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, which we normally pronounce Adonai.
And curses that name with one of the names of God, which are forbidden to be erased, as Leviticus 24:16 states, one who blasphemes God's name.
Right, so God does have other names, which are not considered Hashem B'Forash, which are not the explicit name. The most common that I'm sure you're familiar with is the name Elohim. If you use the Adonai name to blaspheme against the Elohim name or one of the other names of God that we're not allowed to erase, that's blasphemy, using one name against the other to curse. That's the problem. If you don't use the explicit name, or you don't use it against one of God's name, then you haven't committed the crime of blasphemy. You've said something rather horrible, probably, but you haven't actually committed blasphemy. Does that make sense, roughly?
It makes sense.
Right, so we've got the special name cursing God, and God means the other names, including the name that you're using as well. I mean, including the explicit name. So you could use explicit name cursing explicit name, or you could use explicit name cursing one of the other names of God.
But it's still blasphemy.
That would be blasphemy.
Still blasphemy.
But if you were to use another name of God to curse something else or someone else, that is an inappropriate use of God's name, and it's an inappropriate sentence, and for which you would most likely be flogged in the ancient world. But it is not blasphemy, and you would not be executed. All right, as long as you're remembering this formula of name plus curse of God as blasphemy, then we're doing okay. And if that still seems strange that someone would be using God's name to curse God, good. That's supposed to seem strange. Okay, still with me?
Mm-hmm.
Holding on, maybe? Okay.
One is obligated to be stoned to death for blaspheming God's unique name. Should he blaspheme the other names for God, he transgresses a prohibition.
No, for which the penalty would be flogging. It's not execution. That's just breaking a regular mitzvah, that's not a capital crime mitzvah.
There are those who state that one is liable for execution only when one blasphemes the name
Yud He and Vav He, which is the explicit name of God. And so he's pointing out that there are some that say it's not even just if you use the actual name of God or our common substitute, meaning the word Adonai, that you are triggering this blasphemous cycle. Some people argue it's only if it is the four-letter tetragrammaton, the Yud He Vav He, and even if you were to say Adonai, it's not enough to trigger this effect. But Rambam disagrees.
I, however, maintain that one should be stoned to death in both instances.
All right, so Rambam disagrees, but the halacha goes back and forth depending upon who you're reading. But in general, it's either one name that's possible for being used or two names that's possible for being used. It's not 100 different names or 100 different titles. So far, so clear-ish, maybe? Okay.
The fact that a blasphemer retracts his statements in the midst of speaking is of no consequence. Rather, once he utters blasphemy in the presence of witnesses, he is liable for execution by stone.
Right? So you said it. It doesn't matter that you're sorry right afterwards. Well, I mean, it matters in the sense of your own personal spiritual path, but it doesn't matter as far as the court's concerned. Right?
Once it's out, it's out.
Once it's out, it's out. It's, in a similar way, it's like if you commit adultery and then you're really, really upset about it the next morning, you still committed adultery. And yes, your spiritual path will be made easier by having true repentance for what you did, but the punishment is going to remain the same.
Even if you're sorry that you committed adultery.
I mean, let's take something that's a little bit more clear. If I steal $1,000 from you, and then I feel really, really bad about it, does that mean I get to keep the money?
No.
No.
To give it back.
You still got to give it back.
Yes.
And I think, in most circumstances, especially if it was done with force, you'd probably also want me to pay a bit of a penalty. You'd be happy that I felt bad about what I did, but you probably wouldn't be satisfied with me just feeling bad about what I did. And in this particular case of blasphemy, even if you regret the words, which they're just words, you would say, the words are still out, and you have still assaulted everyone around you with them, and you have created this statement, which is extremely damaging, and that needs justice. And that means you're going to be going to court. And if the evidence lines up, it means you're going to be executed. But
should a person curse God's name with the name of a false god, the zealous may strike him and slay him. If the zealous do not slay him and he is brought to court, he is not stoned. That punishment is administered only when one curses God's name with another one of his unique names.
All right. So here is the ultimate confusing irony. We said, and we're just using the word God as our substitute, right? If you say, God cursed God, you've made blasphemy. But if you said, Zeus cursed God, you have not. Somebody that invokes God against God has committed blasphemy. But someone who invokes a pagan, idolatrous deity against God has said nothing. They are still punished for doing this, and they pointed out that yes, in the heat of the moment, somebody could attack them for what they have just said, but once that moment has passed and they're brought to trial, they cannot be executed because the pagan god is nothing. The pagan god is just a noise. It's just some random sound. And even though it is associated with idolatry and everything else that is evil and wrong in the world, it's not real. It has no substance. Only God does. And therefore you can only commit blasphemy by cursing God by God, because any other type of curse is empty, which is going to bring us to our next text.
One is guilty only when he has cursed the divine name by name, said Samuel. It is because Scripture has stated, and he who blasphemes the name of the Lord, when he blasphemes the name of the Lord, shall be put to death.
Right, so he's taking verse 15 and 16 that we were just reading, And he's saying, look at the way the repetition happens. It's you are blaspheming the name of the Lord when you blaspheme the name of the Lord, right? So that you are using God's name in both parts of the equation. You are cursing God with God. That is the only time where you trigger this. And it comes back to what I was just hinting at, with this notion that any other statement about God, any other attack, assault, or insult to God that isn't founded on God is a nonsense babble, right? I mean, it's like saying, let Tinkerbell kill God. It's just, it's fantasy stuff. It has no substance. It has no reality. And therefore you have said nothing for which you can be punished. Well, not executed at least. But when you invoke God by God's own specific and unique name, when you are using the very essence of what God is to condemn God, the essence of what God is, that's where you have created this conflict that can only be resolved by execution. Because you have essentially turned the world against itself. You have taken that which is most pure, holy, and special, and the foundation of all reality, and you have said it should be assaulted by itself, which is essentially a statement that you're saying all of reality should be undone. That's what blasphemy is. It's not just you said something I didn't like. It's not just you said something that made me feel offended, or that got my hair all up in a knot. It's you have said something where you have tried, by invoking God's name, to undo the godliness of the world, which means undoing the world itself. Because nothing else could be used against God but God. And if you went that far, it's you went to the nuclear option. It's you were trying to wield God against God.
So if the atheist says, I don't believe, that's not blasphemy.
No, it would be, in Judaism, it would be considered heresy.
Yes.
Right? They are an apokoros. They are an apostate if they were Jewish and now they've become an atheist. They are a denier of God. And that's no great badge of honor, but it's not blasphemy. And it's not punishable by execution. It's something we would argue against and we would disagree with. And in much of the ancient and medieval society, somebody who said something like that could be punished by excommunication, by being driven out of the community, or by being flogged if they remained within the community. But they could not be executed, and no one would have thought to kill them for having said such a thing.
And how does Judaism approach the person who says, I'm not sure whether I believe in God?
I mean, the agnostic.
Right.
The person who says, I don't know if I believe there's a God or not.
That's not, is that considered heresy?
It would depend upon the way that they said it under what circumstances. It would definitely be considered a alarm bell, and this person needed to be taken in and to be taught and have things explained and figure out what's causing the doubt. But the fact that people doubt either God, or what we see more commonly in the texts is people doubt aspects of God. Similar to Job doubting God's justice when everything was going bad for him, even though there was no just cause. Those types of statements are possible within a place of respect and a place of proper approach to the issue. Same thing with Abraham. When God says he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham steps forward and says, but shouldn't the judge of the world do justice? Meaning that doesn't sound right. And I far be it from me, but I need to figure this out. And that is a perfectly fine and very long tradition within Judaism of wrestling with trying to understand God. And of course, the simple fact is most of us, hopefully in a growing way, but most of us know very little about God. And therefore we are likely to say things that are inaccurate or confused or doubtful of God simply because our knowledge is so small. And we are not punished for that type of ignorance. It's when we make it a principled objection, that it becomes more troublesome. So doubt and confusion is called the human condition. All right, almost to the end.
Said Rabbi Barhana, said Rabbi Yohanan, the ages hand on to their sons and disciples the correct pronunciation of the divine name, made up of 4 letters, repeating the information once every 7 years.
All right, so remember where this whole thing is hinging around the pronunciation of the divine name, the Yud He Vav He, which I don't think we know. That is to say, not just we, the people in this room, but we as far as modern Judaism goes. There have been many groups and many scholars which have advanced hypotheses, but even in the ancient world, the name was only said explicitly once every 7 years in order to teach the students what it was, and that chain of transmission is broken. I'm sure there are people out there who claim that they still have the correct chain and that they still know the real name and all of that, but there is no good attestation, no good provenance that anyone has the precise and correct tradition of how that name should be pronounced, which in many ways renders this entire category of transgression inoperative. Because if you don't have the name, you can't be using it. And if you're not using it, then you're not committing blasphemy.
Even if it's a name, the name that we're using is what is commonly in today's ages.
Well, Rambam argues a little bit on that. And so there are some that would say, yes, you could still technically commit blasphemy if you followed Rambam's opinion about using the substitute name for this. But many, many scholars say, no, it has to be the name itself.
And that is lost.
The pronunciation is
Yes.
lost, exactly. The written name we still have, but the pronunciation, and we are talking about what is said. It is a verbal act to blaspheme, not a written one. That seems to be, by many scholars' estimation, a crime that we can no longer commit because we lack the tool to commit the crime. We just don't have that word, and therefore it can't be done. And again, it comes back to this notion that God's name is central to this, because the name itself, that is to say the Yud He Vav He, is the name that is the name of existence. Right? The word itself, the Yud He Vav He, is a name that is derived, probably really better to say it the opposite way, it is a name that is derived from the root for the word to be, like being, right? You know, I am, you are, he was. You'll often see in the translation of the session with the burning bush, I will be that I will be is the translation of God's name. Essentially, God's name is a statement of existence. And from that, we see the essence of God, that God is a unique form of existence that proceeds, predates, and will antecede us in a form of existence that we cannot fully comprehend, which is why anything short of that can't touch God. And you can't touch God with something of this world. You could only touch God with something of God. And the only piece of God we have is God's name. That's why the name is integral to the act of blasphemy. Because nothing else you can't insult God with anything of this world. It'd be like an ant trying to attack me with, something. What? What are you going to do to me? You're going to throw a chair at God? Which is why it comes back again and again and again to this notion. And why again and again and again, the blasphemer is not just saying something we don't like. The blasphemer is trying to wrestle existence to extinguish itself. And that's what makes it such a dangerous act. Okay.
Any man who curses his God shall bear his sin. Why does it specify any? It serves to encompass idolaters who are admonished not to curse the name, just as Israelites are so admonished.
Okay, so I took a few liberties of the translation here to try and drive home what they're saying. If you look back in verse 15 in the Hebrew, it says ish, ish. The word ish gets repeated twice. Now, the word ish means man or a person. And the fact that it's repeated demands explanation, according to the Talmud. And it says, why would it be repeated? In order to tell us that blasphemy can also be done by non-Jews. That a non-Jew who got the name of God and used it to curse God would be guilty of blasphemy. Most commandments, non-Jews are not responsible for. Right? If a non-Jew eats something that isn't kosher, that's perfectly fine for them. If a non-Jew breaks Shabbat, that's perfectly fine for them. They haven't broken God's law. They would not be punished according to Torah. But for this, if a non-Jew did this in exactly the way we've been describing, they are guilty of blasphemy, and they would suffer the same punishment as an Israelite would.
So the Muslim reversing that.
Mm-hmm.
When they get upset because Muhammad
Mm-hmm.
is being
Defamed,
drawn,
right?
depicted.
Depicted, right?
In their minds, the non-Muslim is committing blasphemy.
Yes, right. So they, as well as Christians for much of history, although it's a softer stance in the modern world, at least not as violent in response, have a definition of blasphemy more like what we began with, which was to say something disparaging about God. And for them, the Muslims, that is to say, they take disparaging about God to also include disparaging about the Prophet Muhammad, whereas the Christians tend to focus entirely on their Trinity. And Judaism is saying, no, it's not just because you said something offensive, it's because you tried to do something offensive. And
Cursing.
well, which was cursing existence through itself. You were trying to turn God against God's self. And that's the offensive act. It's not just that you said the wrong thing at the wrong time. And so, yes, they are similar in the sense that they expect others to adhere to their standards as well, but their definition is much broader than our definition of what is considered to be blasphemy. And that's why you ended up with the shootings in Texas just this last week.
But we as Jews do not expect other religions to adhere to the same.
We do expect other religions to adhere to some things. When we talk about the 7 Noahide laws, we do expect the other religions, the other people of the world, to not be idolatrous. We expect them to not blaspheme God, to not eat a limb torn from an animal, to not commit murder, to not engage in inappropriate licentious behavior, and to establish systems of justice. I didn't count, but I'm not sure if I got all of them there. But we do expect them to have certain standards that must be followed. And this is one of them, is that they are not allowed to commit blasphemy in the way that we've been describing, nor are they allowed to be idolatrous. Then you get into a much longer discussion of, which other religions can still meet those criteria. Obviously, somebody who wasn't practicing any religion but kept the other points would be fine. It would be someone that's of another faith and who keeps the other points that we then have to say, well, is that faith idolatrous or not? And that gets into much longer conversations. All right. Last summary by the Shulchan Aruch.
He who hears the name blasphemed, or even an attribute of God, such as the forgiving one, the merciful one, etc., even if pronounced in a foreign language, must rend his garments, provided he hear it from an Israelite. And an apostate is in these days considered an heathen. And even if he hear it from the mouth of the witness stating how the blasphemer blasphemed, but the witnesses testifying in court need not rend their garments again, having once done so when they first heard the blasphemy. All
right, so Shulchan Aruch from about 500 years ago gives us a summary of the rending in the modern time, modern meaning his contemporary and really on in today, which is the capital crime is gone. That we don't have the name to do so, but we can still be offended when we hear someone malign God using one of the titles of God. But we only are offended, as you can see here, when it is done by a fellow Israelite, by someone else that is B'nai Israel. If somebody is not Jewish and they misuse God's name, we do not need to rend our garments. It's only when a fellow Jew does it. And here he even gives it more specificity and says it has to be a practicing Jew, not someone who is an apostate. If someone has converted out, although we still consider them Jewish, we do not take heed of their words. And therefore they cannot force us to rend our clothing because they have said something offensive. But if a fellow Jew attacks God, then we should be upset. We should feel devastated, and we should rend our garments. And that's the final point that he tries to drive home here, is that we should take our relationship with God and the relationship of our community with God seriously. We don't have to go around executing people, but we do have to feel torn when we see that there is a tear between a fellow Jew and God. That is something that should upset us, and something that we should hope to be able to overcome. We're not going to overcome it by throwing rocks at them, but we can overcome it by trying to find out why they feel the way they feel, whether it be a word spoken in anger because of some other issue that needs to be resolved. And I'll point you back for your own further research, the story of the man that in our Torah portion who was cursing God that got all this going. The story goes that he was trying to settle with his mother's tribe, the Dan, and they wouldn't let him because his father was Egyptian. And so he went to Moses and asked for a court decision about this, and Moses said, well, you're not from that tribe, so you can't settle with them. And that's when he walked out of the courtroom and said what he said. So oftentimes when we hear somebody say something like this, we need to find out what the real issue is and why it has driven them to say such an offensive thing about God. And if someone has said something about God offensively, we should also want to figure out what happened there. If it wasn't for some ulterior reason, there must still be something wrong to make someone say something like that. And that needs to be our first response, is to be upset that it has been said, and then try to figure out a way to bring the person peace so that they would never say such a thing again. Make sense? Maybe? It's not easy, I know. I always pick the hard stuff. All right, keep studying.
Stretches us.
Yeah. Well, you don't go to the exercise class to sit on the sofa.